For decades, humanity had been the kind of species that smiled in the face of danger. Earth, known across the galaxy as the birthplace of the Deathworlders, had long since earned a reputation for resilience. Despite the deadly environment of their home planet, where apex predators roamed, and the weather was as violent as any war, the humans were seen as the most diplomatic of species. They had the best trade deals, the most accessible colonies, and an unwavering reputation for kindness that stretched from the farthest reaches of space to the grand halls of the Galactic Council. Major Jake Collins, a seasoned negotiator and former combat veteran, was the face of humanity's goodwill. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile that made most aliens think they could trust him, Collins had spent most of his life handling delicate negotiations. He knew how to keep his cool in front of the most volatile species, especially the Griv. The Griv were smooth operators, slippery and quick-witted, with a talent for turning any conversation into a profitable one. They were known as traders, but to the sharp-eyed humans, they were also opportunists. Collins had dealt with them before, more times than he could count, and had always made sure humanity came out ahead. But this time was different. As Collins stood on the balcony of the interstellar trade station Helix, overlooking the bustling docking bay, his mind wandered back to the deal that had just gone wrong. Major Collins came the voice of Captain Amelia Hart, sharp and crisp. Her presence was commanding, even more so after the recent mission to the mining world of Osler 7. "We have a problem." She handed him a datapad, which he scanned with growing frustration. The Griv, it seemed, had sabotaged a critical shipment of medical supplies meant for a famine-stricken colony on the planet Xander 3. What was supposed to be a simple trade contract had turned into a disaster. The Griv had slipped in counterfeit parts, leaving the freighter vulnerable to pirate attacks. Not only had they cost lives, but they'd also stolen the human tech in the process. "Damn it," Collins muttered, tossing the pad onto the table with a loud slap. "Not again." "Another Griv scam?" Hart asked, though she already knew the answer. She'd fought on the front lines for years, watching the galaxy's growing disdain for humanity's softness. "Yeah, and this time, they've pushed too far," Collins said, his jaw tight. "They've already taken half of our medical supplies and left our crew stranded. They've cost us millions, and worse, put lives at risk. They think we'll just let it slide, like always." "Are we?" Hart asked, her eyes narrowing. There was no mistaking the challenge in her voice. "No," Collins said, his voice low and deadly. "We're not letting this slide. Not anymore." The Griv had always played the long game, and they were good at it. So good that the galaxy had come to think of them as trusted allies, their smooth-talking traders an essential part of the intergalactic economy. No one would have guessed that a species so seemingly harmless, so skilled at negotiation, could be behind the betrayal that would spark the end of humanity's tolerance. By the time Major Collins and Captain Hart had assembled the response team, word had spread across the station like wildfire. Humanity was done being the galaxy's doormat. Collins stood at the front of the command center aboard the human flagship Indomitable, staring at the holographic display of the Xander 3 system. He could see the freighter, Orion's Pride, drifting, a helpless wreck caught in the gravity well of a nearby asteroid field. The pirates had already gutted it, and the Griv had vanished as soon as the attack began. A standard hit and run, nothing out of the ordinary. Except for one thing. The Griv were the ones who had set the whole thing up. "They knew," Collins muttered, slamming his fist into the console. "They knew the freighter was vulnerable. They intentionally sold us faulty parts. And now they're gone. No response to our comms. Wouldn't be the first time they've left us holding the bag," Hart said, her eyes scanning the data feed. "But this time, it's different. We're not dealing with pirates. We're dealing with a betrayal." "You're damn right." Collins leaned forward, fingers splayed across the table as his mind ran through the possibilities. The Griv had done this to them before. Minor sabotage here, a shady deal there. But this time they had crossed a line. They hadn't just stolen supplies, they had endangered lives. We give them one chance to make it right. One. Hart gave a grim nod. And if they don't, they won't. Colin's tone was final, his jaw set. We'll hit them where it hurts. The decision was swift, almost instinctual. The Indomitable would remain in orbit above Helix, its fleet ready for rapid deployment. Meanwhile, a team of elite operatives, led by Hart, would infiltrate the Griv trade hubs scattered across the sector. They would demand an explanation and make it clear that humanity would no longer tolerate being taken advantage of. Prepare for a confrontation, Collins ordered, turning to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Rachel Myers. Get me the Griv ambassador. Now, Hart didn't need to hear the order to know what was coming. The moment humanity turned the corner from diplomacy to action, things would change. Forever. The Griv ambassador, Tarek Velios, was no stranger to human diplomacy. He'd watched Earth's envoys at countless trade negotiations, marveled at their ability to smile through the tightest situations, and always left with a feeling that they were too kind, too eager to forgive. He'd assumed that was humanity's greatest weakness. That assumption evaporated the moment he received Collins' encrypted message. We need to talk. Bring yourself to Helix Station immediately. You have 1 hour. The ambassador had been prepared for a difficult meeting. Humans were tough negotiators, after all. But the tone of the message felt different. The usual courteousness was missing, replaced by an edge that sent a cold shiver down his spine. The Indomitable wasn't just in orbit above Helix. It had deployed its entire battle group. A dozen warships, their sleek bodies armed with the latest human weaponry, surrounded the station like a pack of wolves waiting for their prey to make a mistake. Tarek had no intention of making a mistake. He'd seen what the Deathworlders were capable of when they finally got angry, but he had never expected them to take things this far. When he arrived in the Helix Command Center, his usual bravado was gone. Captain Hart, standing beside Collins, stared at him with an expression that could freeze water. Her eyes locked onto his with a clarity he had never felt before in the presence of a human. Ambassador Velios, Collins said, his voice clipped and professional, but there was a raw anger simmering underneath. You'll excuse the formalities, but we're done with the games. Tarek's throat went dry. He had expected a reprimand, perhaps an angry word or two about the faulty parts or the missing supplies. What he hadn't expected was this. Collins wasn't merely angry, he was resolved. You've gone too far, Collins continued, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. We've been patient with you and your people for years. You exploit our goodwill, deceive us, and profit at our expense. But no more. This isn't a negotiation anymore. Tarek's heart pounded as he realized what Collins was implying. The humans had always been the ones to offer the olive branch, to give second chances. But now, there were no more chances. The Deathworlders had decided they were done with being the universe's punching bag. Tarek began, but Collins cut him off with a single raised hand. Don't bother, Collins said, the corner of his mouth curling into a grim smile. You can apologize all you want, but your actions speak louder than your words ever could. We know what you did, and we know who's behind it. And let me make this very clear. This is not something you'll walk away from. Captain Hart stepped forward, her voice like steel. You and your people are going to make this right. And if you don't, I'll make sure the whole galaxy knows exactly who you are, who you really are. Tarek's mind raced. The Indomitable's fleet wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Humanity wasn't just angry, they were preparing for war. If you think you can intimidate us, Tarek started, his voice shaking, you're gravely mistaken. Get out of here, Collins interrupted, his gaze cold. We've heard enough. You'll have until tomorrow morning to resolve this, or we'll make you wish you had. Tarek didn't need to hear more. He turned sharply and left the room, his mind a whirl of disbelief and fear. He knew the human reputation for stubbornness. But this was something else entirely. Humanity wasn't just standing up for themselves. They were preparing to obliterate anyone who dared cross them. This section is designed to ramp up the tension and show the immediate consequences of humanity's shift. The stakes are now clear, and the Griv are on the back foot, unsure of how to handle the wrath of the Deathworlders. Tarek Velios didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The weight of humanity's words echoed in his mind like an insistent drumbeat. He had underestimated them. Now he was faced with an impossible choice: fix the mess the Griv had made, or face the wrath of the Deathworlders. The following morning, as the Griv trade delegation scrambled to prepare a response, the Indomitable's fleet remained a silent, looming presence in orbit above Hillock Station. The tension in the command center was palpable. Collins, Hart, and the entire human military apparatus stood ready, awaiting any sign of movement from the Griv. "You think they'll come to the table?" Captain Hart asked, her arms folded across her chest, eyes never leaving the holographic screen. The Griv ambassador was still nowhere to be found. "They'll try," Collins said, his voice low and calculating. "But they won't give us what we want. Not without a fight. They've made their bed." Collins wasn't wrong. The Griv had been operating under the assumption that humanity's reputation for diplomacy and kindness meant they would always forgive transgressions. But that assumption had just shattered. The days of pacifying the galaxy with offers of trade and cooperation were over. Now, humanity was prepared to make an example of anyone who dared cross them. "I'll give them one last chance," Collins muttered, looking down at the comm panel. He pressed a few buttons, and the image of Tarek Velios flickered onto the screen. The Griv ambassador appeared, looking pale and strained. His usual smooth demeanor was gone, replaced by something far more desperate. His eyes flicked nervously toward the fleet, then back to Collins. "Major Collins." "Aye." "Cut the crap, Velios," Collins interrupted. His voice was steel. "You've got until noon to make this right. Every Griv operative in this sector is going to pay for the damage you caused. I'm giving you the option to resolve this peacefully, but you need to understand one thing. If you don't comply, humanity will treat you like we would treat any other enemy." Tarek's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to humans being so direct, so unforgiving. "We've been in business with you for years. You can't possibly be serious." "I'm dead serious," Collins shot back. "You have no idea what you've started. This isn't about a few lost supplies. This is about respect. You've taken too much, and now it's time to settle the bill. If you don't honor that agreement, if you don't deliver what you promised, and more, then we'll come for you. All of you." Tarek's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and fear. "I can't make that kind of decision. I don't have the authority." "Then get someone who does." Collins cut him off, the edges of his voice hard as stone. "I'm tired of negotiating. You know where we stand." The transmission ended abruptly. Collins turned to Hart, who gave him a sharp nod. "The moment he walks out that door, we send a message. No more waiting." Outside the command center, Tarek stumbled back from the comm panel, his mind racing. He knew what was coming. The Griv couldn't back down now, not without losing everything they had worked for. But what could they offer humanity that would satisfy them? What would be enough to quell the rage that had turned the Deathworlders into something terrifying? As he moved to leave, he made one final call to the Griv High Council. It was time to decide how far they were willing to go to stop a war, or just the pressure on the Griv mounts, and humanity's resolve becomes undeniable. The stakes are higher, and the Griv are left scrambling to figure out how to respond to the sheer force of human will. The Griv High Council had gathered in their grand vaulted chamber, a room designed to instill awe and obedience. Tarek Velios stood before them, his heart pounding in his chest as he explained the dire situation. His usual flair for diplomacy was gone, replaced by a growing sense of panic. "We're out of time," Tarek said, his voice tight. "The humans are no longer negotiating. They threaten to go to war if we don't deliver on every single promise they made. If we don't act now, we risk losing everything. Their fleet, it's unlike anything we've seen. The council's leader, a tall, stern figure named Vreth, regarded him with a cold, calculating stare. The Griv were no strangers to war. In fact, they often played both sides of the conflict to their advantage. But humanity was a different kind of threat. If the Deathworlders were as enraged as Tarek claimed, the Griv's entire power structure could crumble in a matter of days. "You're telling us to give them everything?" Vreth asked, his tone laced with incredulity. "What exactly would that accomplish?" "We lose face, Tarek. We lose control. Our entire empire is built on these deals. You want us to give up our leverage for a few supplies and some bad deals." Tarek's hand clenched into a fist. "It's not just about supplies, Vreth. It's about survival. If we don't comply, they'll make sure we never trade again. They'll destroy us, our fleets, our stations, everything. They'll make an example of us." A murmur rippled through the council, but Vreth raised a hand, silencing them. "You're telling me we have no other option?" Vreth asked, his voice low, dangerous. "The Griv don't bend, Tarek. We never bend." Tarek swallowed hard, but his mind was made up. "Then we risk everything. If the humans are serious about this, they won't stop until we're nothing." The silence in the room was suffocating. The council exchanged looks, weighing their options. Finally, Vreth leaned back in his chair and spoke in a voice like gravel. "If the humans are so eager for war, let them have it." At that moment, Tarek realized the council had already decided. They would not back down. The Griv would retaliate, not with diplomacy, but with strength. If they couldn't win the humans' respect with trade, they would force it with fear. Back on Helix, Major Collins watched the comm feed from the Griv High Council's response. He knew this moment was coming. The Griv had never been ones to capitulate easily, but the decision still stung. As the transmission ended and the council's final message flickered out, Collins turned to Captain Hart, his jaw tight. "They've made their choice," Collins said, his voice dark with finality. "We're going to show them just how wrong they are." Hart nodded grimly, already making preparations. "We'll have to act fast. We can't give them time to regroup." Collins stepped toward the viewport, staring out at the vastness of space. The human fleet, poised and ready, hovered in orbit like a shadow over the Griv sector. It was time to send the message that the galaxy would never forget. "No more patience," Collins muttered under his breath. "No more negotiation. The Griv are about to learn what happens when you push humanity too far." By the time the Indomitable's fleet entered the Griv-controlled sector, they had already launched a countermeasure, one that, in the past, might have been enough to stall a weaker opponent. A large contingent of Griv warships, heavily reinforced and retrofitted with black market weapons, emerged from a hidden nebula. The Griv weren't coming to the table. They were preparing for a fight. "So it begins," Collins muttered, watching the data feed from his command chair. The holographic display showed the Griv fleet taking position, a line of battle cruisers and frigates bristling with energy shields and heavy guns. "We've got no choice now," Captain Hart said, her voice steady but tense. "They've called our bluff." "Not quite," Collins replied, eyes narrowing. "This isn't a bluff. We're going to show them what happens when they push us to the edge." The Indomitable's fleet responded with military precision. At Collins' order, the human ships deployed into their combat formation, a tightly coordinated array of dreadnoughts, assault cruisers, and frigates. It wasn't just the numbers that made humanity formidable. It was their ability to fight with a brutal efficiency that rivaled the most battle-hardened species in the galaxy. Years of surviving a dangerous planet had taught them how to turn any situation to their advantage. "We're outnumbered," Lieutenant Myers pointed out, her fingers flying across the console. "The Griv's fleet is larger by a factor of 3. If this turns into a full-scale battle—" "It won't," Collins interrupted, his voice cold and confident. "We've got the technology, and we've got the will. We don't fight like they do." Tactical analysis complete, Hart said, stepping forward. Our first wave will be diversionary, long-range missiles, EMPs, targeting their command systems. Once we've disrupted their coordination, we move in for the kill. Do it, Collins ordered, leaning forward in his chair. His voice was ice-cold. Let's show them how we do things. As the first salvo of missiles rocketed toward the Griv ships, the human fleet activated its jamming systems. A wave of electromagnetic pulses rippled outward, causing the Griv fleet's communication networks to buckle. The Griv had expected an initial strike, but nothing prepared them for the sheer efficiency of humanity's response. Their ships were suddenly cut off from each other. Command was lost. Panic set in. Direct hit, Myers called out. Their central communications hub is down. We've isolated their fleet. They can't regroup. Collins watched the Griv ships falter. For all their superior numbers, they were paralyzed without coordination. The moment their formations shattered, humanity's assault cruisers moved in. Quick, aggressive, and deadly. The first human strikes hit with surgical precision, targeting weak points in the Griv shields and tearing through hulls with devastating impact. On the Indomitable, the atmosphere was eerily calm despite the battle raging outside. Collins' eyes never left the display. His orders were short, direct, and merciless. There was no hesitation. Humanity was no longer interested in diplomacy. The message had already been sent. The Griv's response came swiftly, a desperate counterattack that saw their warships attempting to regroup and form a defensive line. But it was too late. The first wave of human ships had already breached their outer defenses. Their flanks were exposed, and the human fleet was everywhere. We're hitting them at their weakest points, Hart said, satisfaction creeping into her voice. They're breaking apart. Collins nodded, but his expression remained hard. They crossed the line. This isn't over until they're done. The Griv had underestimated the Deathworlders in a way no species ever should have. In the span of a few hours, the once proud Griv fleet had been reduced to smoldering wreckage, their warships scattered across the black void of space like broken toys. Their central command had been completely decimated by humanity's precision strike, leaving their remaining ships disoriented and vulnerable. Tarek Velios stood on the bridge of the last operational Griv warship, Aegis, watching in horror as the human fleet closed in. The Indomitable had already crushed their defenses, and the remnants of the Griv ships had no chance of survival. The message had been sent. Humanity wasn't just willing to fight. They were willing to annihilate. Sir, we have multiple breaches in the aft hull. They're targeting our engines, the tactical officer reported, voice strained. We can't hold them off much longer. Tarek's mind raced, his thoughts fragmented by the sheer scope of the disaster unfolding. The Griv had always been able to worm their way out of tight situations before, diplomatically, strategically, or through sheer manipulation. But the humans had no patience for those games anymore. They had come with one goal: total dominance. Prepare the evacuation pods, Tarek ordered, his voice shaking. He knew there was no real escape. Humanity's fleet had already sealed off their exits. The Aegis was finished. The Griv were finished. Back aboard the Indomitable, Major Collins stood before the command table, his expression unreadable as the final Griv ship was wiped from the map. The battle was over, and humanity had emerged victorious with no losses and minimal damage. The humans had sent a clear message: cross them, and you would cease to exist as you knew it. All Griv vessels destroyed, Lieutenant Myers confirmed, looking up from the console. No survivors. Collins' lips tightened into a grim line. There was no joy in victory. Not yet. Not when it had come at the cost of so many lives. But this was war, and the Griv had brought it upon themselves. What happens next? Hart asked, her voice a quiet echo in the command room. The fight was over, but the consequences would ripple throughout the galaxy. We send a message, Collins said, his tone resolute. Humanity doesn't back down. We don't just tolerate betrayal. We eradicate it, and anyone who thinks they can push us around in the future is going to learn the same lesson. We've made sure the Griv can't hurt us again, Hart said, watching the holographic display of the battlefield. The remnants of the Griv fleet drifted like ghosts in space, a testament to humanity's brutal efficiency. But the galaxy is watching. What will they think of us now? Collins didn't answer immediately. His eyes swept across the battlefield display, lingering on the broken wrecks of Griv warships. The message wasn't just for the Griv. It was for every species that had ever underestimated humanity, every faction that had viewed Earth's peacekeeping efforts as weakness. The universe had just learned the hard way that humanity wasn't interested in negotiation anymore. Humanity was a force of nature, unstoppable, unforgiving, and resolute. "We'll see soon enough," Collins finally replied. "But one thing's for sure. The era of human kindness is over." This section wraps up the battle with humanity emerging as the undisputed victor. And now the wider galaxy must reckon with the consequences of crossing the Deathworlders. The tone is decisively dark, and the shift in the balance of power is undeniable. The news spread like wildfire across the galaxy. For weeks, every channel, every trade route, and every diplomatic meeting buzzed with whispers of humanity's brutal victory over the Griv. Reports came in from the outer colonies and council halls, some of fear, some of admiration, but all of awe. Humanity had always been known for its diplomacy, its commitment to peace, and its ability to pull even the most hostile species into negotiations. But now, after the massacre of the Griv fleet, the galaxy was forced to confront a chilling new reality. Earth's Deathworlders were no longer the gentle diplomats they once seemed. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the consequences of crossing them were clear. On Helix Station, Major Collins and Captain Hart stood in front of the observation window, watching the stars. The fleet had returned, but the victory felt hollow. There was no triumph in their eyes, no sense of celebration. They had done what was necessary, but the weight of it hung heavy on their shoulders. "Do you think they'll come for us?" Hart asked, her voice quieter than usual. Collins didn't respond right away. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the implications of what had just happened. He had known it was coming. The Griv had pushed them too far, and humanity had been patient for far too long. But now, as the dust settled, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had unleashed. The universe had seen what humanity was capable of, and they weren't sure whether it would lead to peace or war. "They'll think twice before crossing us again," Collins said finally, his voice calm but resolute. "And anyone who thinks humanity's been too soft will know better now." But Hart wasn't so sure. What about the others? The Zor, the Vinteri, the Tikal. "We've always had to balance diplomacy with force. Now we've tipped the scales too far. We've made enemies. Let them try," Collins said, his gaze never leaving the stars. "Let them come. The galaxies learned their lesson today. There's no more room for weakness." Back on Earth, the news hit the council. The politicians, scientists, and diplomats who had long crafted humanity's image of peace and cooperation now faced a serious dilemma. The Griv had been destroyed, but the fallout was far from over. Humanity's sudden shift was creating new tensions, new questions. Would the galaxy begin to isolate Earth for its ruthless approach? Or would they follow humanity's lead, understanding that survival sometimes meant sacrificing diplomacy? But one thing was certain: the era of human kindness, of giving second chances and seeking compromise, was officially over. Humanity was no longer the galaxy's gentle negotiator. They were a Deathworld species, and the universe had just learned that they would no longer tolerate betrayal. As the council convened in tense silence, a single broadcast message from Major Collins played on every screen across the system. One final declaration: